Hi, everybody. Welcome to Tough to Treat. This is Susan Clinton, one of your co hosts. And today we have a shorter podcast where I am discussing the differences between food allergies and food intolerances or sensitivities. This is an important topic as so much is going around about what people should and shouldn't eat and what contributes to inflammation and what doesn't. This one really follows the science and talks about what true allergies are versus sensitivities. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Don't forget to join us at www.toughtotreat.com and or follow us on YouTube. Enjoy the episode. Thank you. Food allergies versus food intolerances. This is all the buzz these days. Let me try and see if I can shed a little bit of science on it and make some sense out of what the literature is talking about. If we're going to define food allergies, we're going to look at IgE antibodies produced by lymphocytes specific to the allergen, which is basically an immune reaction by attaching itself to the mast cell surfaces in different tissues of the body. That comes from a histamine release via the circulatory system. So when we talked earlier about the submucosal cell walls breaking down and larger proteins getting out into the blood supply in the submucosal layer, that's exactly what we're talking about. When those get into the bloodstream, the blood tells the body it's time to build some antibodies against whatever this foreign invader is, because this protein does not belong in the bloodstream. So some of the things that can happen, because it is going through the circulatory system, is we can get a lot of systemic effects from food allergies. Sinusitis, eczema, itching, airway restrictions, difficulty swallowing, breathing, anaphylaxis reactions, nausea, and vomiting. It's the system's approach to get something out of there. We can also have symptoms of allergies that often match those of intolerances. How do we tell the difference between the two? Sometimes blood tests are helpful. After you ingest the allergen, then you're going to build up the antibodies and be able to test for it in the bloodstream. Food-dependent exercise-induced anaphylaxis is also a thing, especially teenagers and young adults who break out after exercise. So after they go to exercise, they are really itchy, they're lightheaded, they have hives, they have asthma, abdominal symptoms, and or anaphylaxis. And generally, you're going to find that these kids are also asthmatics. We do want them exercising, but maybe they need to be cautioned to not eat 2 hours before they exercise. So they need a chance for their system, for whatever reason, to take care of some of the digestion before they start to eat, before they start to exercise, because perhaps for them, as soon as they start to exercise, their GI system shuts down, and that's when they're starting to have the problems. So here's some of the most common food allergies and intolerances that we know about there. Number one on the list is lactose or dairy. Dairy is a highly inflammatory food for many people. Fructose, which you're going to find in honey, high fructose corn syrup, and agave. Sorbitol and mannitol are the substances that are found in artificial sweeteners. Gluten and fructans are protein in wheat, barley, rye, and wheat fiber. GOS is fiber in the beans, hummus in the soy. Citrus is acidic, and corn and soy are problematic because they're loaded with GMOs. In the United States, most of the soy supply is 95% GMO. The most common gold standard way of finding out if you have an intolerance is to eliminate it. There isn't any other way that we can find it unless you do an elimination diet. It is the gold standard. The most common food proteins that cause intolerances are cow's milk, protein, and gluten from wheat. So with cow's milk, that's also cheese and cream and butter, all of those other substances. So it's not so much that you want to take something away, but you got to replace it with something. And these are the most common ones that people will remove in an elimination diet and let the system rest and find out how they're feeling. Once they've been off for a while, you can try to bring it back in and see how they do. Sometimes people just need a rest from it. Their mucosal layer of their intestine needs to heal up the leaky gut, and then they can probably return to some of those foods. Sometimes they can't. They just can't do it, and that's okay. Some people are just not going to be able to have any kind of dairy at all. Some people are not going to do well with gluten. Before anybody starts an elimination diet of any kind, and they're asking my opinion about it, and the nutritionists I work with also subscribe to this, they must have a celiac blood test first, because if they are celiac disease, they will never be putting gluten back in their diet again. So if you eliminate gluten from the diet, and then a month or 3 months later you do a blood test to see if somebody has celiac disease, it's going to come up negative because the antibodies are not there. We haven't ingested the allergen, so therefore we are not producing any more antibodies. So before anybody starts an elimination diet, they should find out if they have celiac. So a modified elimination diet removes these, and as you get rid of those and see where you are, you can often look to other foods that are craved or eaten a lot and see if you remove those and see how they feel with that. I think for people with GI dysfunction, they really probably need to be on an elimination diet a lot longer than 30 days. The colon is an organ that's slow to change lanes. It doesn't like to change, and it's not going to produce the results that you want probably in just a short period of time, like 30 days. It takes a lot longer in order to really see the benefits. So a lot has been written about FODMAPs, and this particular diet and the research around it is probably the most robust research in nutritional science that we have today. All of this is taking place in Australia, and they've been updating and changing based on their results for the last 10 to 15 years. Basically, the FODMAP diet is a diet that is low in certain sugars and certain fibers capable of causing diarrhea, constipation, gas, bloating, and abdominal pain in people with irritable bowel syndrome. In other words, they're the foods that ferment. Poorly absorbed and rapidly fermented by the gut bacteria, increased gas and increased fluid buildup in bowels, and symptoms delayed until hours after eating. So that's generally what happens when people eat those FODMAPs. They found in this particular diet for these people, they found significant sustainable relief in 75 to 85% of the IBS population that they are actually treating. And you'll see the website on this slide that will help you go to that, read their research, and find out what's new in the FODMAP world. Again, this is an elimination diet. It's not meant to be forever. It's meant to get people's symptoms down and get them really comfortable, and then they begin to start to add certain things back in, one at a time, to see how they tolerate those foods returning to their diet. So FODMAP means fermentable oligo monosaccharides and polyols. What does that mean? Doesn't really matter. It means lactose, fructose, sorbitol, mannitol, fructans, and the proteins you find in soy and beans. Okay, so they have a whole list of them on this website, and they talk about how you remove them. But I think the most interesting thing of all is the first two things they remove are the first two things that we know that are on the most commonly intolerable or low tolerance for food, which is dairy and fructose. So if we're going to look at allergies versus sensitivities, let's start with celiac disease. Celiac is an autoimmune disorder triggered by wheat and other grain proteins, genetically susceptible. And gluten sensitivity can have all of the same symptoms with apparently normal intestinal mucosa. Most of the time, gluten sensitivity is acquired, and it tends to be much more systemic than celiac disease. Celiac can really just affect the gut and make people feel really badly if they ingest food that has gluten in it. Gluten sensitivity comes up later, and it tends to involve much more of the whole systemic process. Why? Because it's getting into the bloodstream. So it affects organs other than the small bowel, but it does affect the nervous system, and they have found gluten sensitivity in people with cerebellar ataxia, peripheral neuropathy, and drug-resistant seizures. They've also found that the antibiotics, that there's some AGA antibiotics that are often absent in people with gluten sensitivity, and those are the TG2s, 3s, and IgAs, and some of the ones you see on the slide there. And the way that they know that they feel better is they have a clinical response from removal. In other words, they take them off the gluten and their symptoms start to abate. This is a great study that came out of The Lancet, which is probably the most important journal that you can find in the world of neurology. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity is kind of the big hot topic because a lot of people are saying there's no such thing. But what we're finding slowly is we're finding the science behind it may be more of a thing than we think it is. So when you have somebody who you think they may have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or they think they do, when they remove the gluten, it leads to a complete regression of their symptoms. That's a great thing. That means that they don't have to be dependent on other things to make them feel better. They can find alternative ways to eat. You can do food challenges, and the ones that they've done have shown sensitivity occurs within several hours or days after ingestion. However, celiac will occur within an hour or two. So people with gluten sensitivity oftentimes don't really know because they don't feel bad for a couple of days later that they start to feel bad. And they're not going to remember that, oh, I ate that on Saturday and now on Tuesday I don't feel good. They're going to think, gosh, what did I do on Monday that I don't feel good on Tuesday? Some of the other things that go around gluten sensitivity is headaches, joint pain, muscle pain, chronic fatigue, immune system decrease, increased sinus infections, and depression. So oftentimes getting people off of gluten can really change a lot of those health markers for them and make them feel a lot better. In 2012, in Gastroenterology, the American Journal, they did a study, a double-blind placebo-controlled challenge, looking to confirm or dispute wheat gluten sensitivity. And what they did was they took two groups of people, and one group of people they gave a pill that had gluten in it, and the other group of people had the pill that didn't have gluten in it. And they all ate the exact same diet, everything. Everything was the same. The only thing that was different was that capsule. And then they recorded how the people felt. And then at the end of 30 days, they switched it. And so then if you were in the group that didn't get the gluten, you got the gluten. And after that, they did, in another 30 days, they checked it again. And what they found was the people who had sensitivity did better when they weren't on gluten and did worse when they were. And it was a great way of a double-blind study to kind of start uncovering and revealing and trying to figure out, what is this gluten sensitivity thing? How big is it? And how can we start looking to find it? In this slide, you're going to see that I kind of drew this out for you just a little bit with IBS. If you look at it, you'll see IBS symptoms can be broken down into gluten-related disorders and or adverse reaction to food. Okay, in the gluten-related disorders, do they have celiac disease, wheat allergies, or just gluten sensitivity? And if you remove the gluten from that, their IBS symptoms should abate. Okay, then the other group of IBS symptoms are more of an adverse reaction to food. And so under those, you're going to have more of your lactose intolerance, your food allergies, your FODMAP intolerances, and actually food chemical intolerance. So it's very, very interesting. IBS is not a simple thing. People have IBS, but maybe for very, very, very different reasons. So some people are just intolerant of chemicals, and maybe it's even just chemicals in their house. You know, we've kind of are in unprecedented times for chemicals and stuff in our world, and some people just don't react well to them. It's just the way it is. So this is kind of a nice way for nutritionists and people to kind of begin to break this down and make sense of this a little bit. The gut microbiome is going to play a large part in how we actually ferment foods or dissolve foods or digest foods or do things. But we also have to give the gut microbiota a lot more spotlights than just that. Because one of the things that we have learned now is that it plays an active and early role in the development of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. What does that mean? That means that it's our ability to react and unreact to stress over our lifespan. Part of it is a learned response, but part of it is also driven and governed by the gut microbiota. Remember, 95% of the serotonin that the brain needs, which is the brain happy juice, is manufactured in the gut and delivered up through the vagal system. So if the gut is not working right or we don't have the right gut microbiome, we're going to have more problems. So in this slide, you can see that the gut microbiota has influence over gut GI function, central nervous system circuitry, the autonomic nervous system, and the immune system. When we have a dysfunction or a disorder or something going on here, that can cause us to either gain weight or store fat. Maybe have a barrier function in our GI system, in other words, leaky gut, so the wrong things are getting into the bloodstream and causing us to have an immune reaction. Low-grade inflammation, stress reactivity, and behavioral changes. So what we thought might be a chemical disturbance in the brain as running behaviors, now we're finding that it's probably more of an interaction of the gut microbiome creating those chemicals that are giving us the behavioral changes. Several studies, mostly animal right now, with the gut microbiome, keep that in mind, have shown that the microbiota influence behavior, can influence immune challenges that influence anxiety and depressive-like behaviors that are associated with, a change in the microbiota. They can be mediated by probiotics. And there is a group out there now that is like really looking at this, and that's the Foundation for Fecal Transplant. And this group has actually started doing human fecal transplants to see how people are able to change when they introduce a new microbiome to them. And so the law of unintended consequences, some people had their depression changed and they were not depressed anymore and things were different, but they also, from that particular person that they got it from, also started gaining weight. So the gut microbiome controls a lot of different things, so we have to kind of put a little more science behind it to figure out what actually does what, and what strains of probiotics really are good for this and maybe good for that, or are there problems with probiotics? Should everybody be on one? These are questions we just don't know the answers to yet. The gut microbiota functions at the intersection between the host genotype and the diet to modulate host physiology and metabolism that can affect weight gain. So increased energy harvest from the diet, modulation of lipid metabolism, altered endocrine function, and increased inflammatory tone can play a big role in weight gain. So it's another environmental factor that modulates obesity and plays a role, maybe other than metabolic disorders. Some of the diets we put people on may not be good because maybe it's restricting and keeping some of the good gut microbiome from growing. So yes, they may lose weight at the beginning, but why do they have that massive weight gain as soon as they go off? So there's a lot of unanswered questions that I think when we look deeper into the gut microbiome, we're going to be able to find out a lot more information. So other animal studies have shown a relationship between the gut microbiota and the development of autoimmune diseases and cancer, metabolic diseases such as diabetes, atherosclerosis, endocrine function, inflammatory bowel disease, which is like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and also in C. diff. And one of the things to keep in mind that they're talking about in the American Heart Society and everywhere is that atherosclerosis is no longer a consequence of cholesterol per se, but of the inflammatory response within the arteries, and that's causing the blood supply to plaque up the cholesterol. So it's an inflammatory condition, much more than it is a condition driven by cholesterol. The role of the gut microbiota has also been studied on its effect with gluten intolerances as well as other food intolerances. So sometimes the reason people may develop an intolerance for food is because maybe they've been sick and taken lots and lots and lots of antibiotics, and it's changed their gut microbiome, and now they can no longer tolerate certain foods that they could before because they no longer have the bacteria, that's going to take care of it, and it's given them a sensitivity. Finally, a little bit on probiotics. Probiotics are non-pathogenic microorganisms that are expected to exert a positive influence on the health of the physiology of the host. So we have intestinal physiology, and then we want to, and it's a full ecosystem, and the ecosystem is what governs the physiology of the host or the human. So probiotics are expected to exert a positive influence on that. They can be helpful for GI disturbances. Yogurt can be helpful for individuals with lactose maldigestion. It can be, in some people it can't be. It can shorten the duration of antibiotic causes of diarrhea. So oftentimes when people are going on antibiotics, they get a secondary result of diarrhea, that the probiotic can begin to change that pretty rapidly. They're using probiotics to prevent the recurrence of C. diff rather than continuing to feed them more antibiotics. They found out it was better. Infants with diarrhea due to rotavirus, they're giving them probiotics and finding much more positive results. And then alleviation of diarrhea from general causes as well as traveler's diarrhea. So instead of taking Cipro, if you get traveler's diarrhea and you've crossed the international date line, it may be wise to do probiotics. We don't know yet. That's what they're looking at and starting to study. There was a Russian study of 30 people with functional bowel disease, Rome criterion 3. 14 with functional constipation and 16 with IBS constipation. They did a normal fluorine therapy, probiotic. So they were looking for a normalization of intestinal motor activity and positive changes in the colon ecosystem. And what they were finding was changes of metabolic activity of the colonic microflora and its generic composition. They had a normalization of the anaerobic-aerobic relations and a restoration of a luminal environment. So what does that mean? They were swelling less in their lumen, and it seemed like their anaerobic-aerobic relationship had improved. They did have some elimination of the symptoms of intestinal dyspepsia and rumbling flatulence. So it did have a little bit of a positive effect on that, but they weren't able to show much more. Again, very low study. Probiotics and non-absorbable antibiotics for IBS has also been studied, and there's been several small trials. And they're looking to see if if this is going to be something that's going to help out their symptoms over time. This is all very new science, and although it may be helping some markers in the IBS patient, sometimes it's not clear if it's helping the overall quality and pain management in these patients.